Hello, this is Paul Chapman and welcome to another Sabbath Bible Lesson Teacher Video Aids. We're going through the Sabbath Bible lessons entitled The Light of the World. This is part one of a four-part series of the Sabbath Bible lessons for this year. We're going through the children of Israel's, actually how God was calling people in every generation to be lights for Him, from Adam through to the children of Israel's wanderings in the wilderness, to the close of their wanderings actually. So we've seen now, we've come through to the children of Israel, and we're going to go through some of the pitfalls and dangers and lessons that we can learn from their experience, the history of their wanderings there, and what we can pick up for ourselves, particularly in view of the fact that we are living on the borders of a spiritual Canaan today, that we are got heaven before us, hell to shun, and what can we do to ensure that we don't make and repeat the same mistakes that they repeated those many centuries ago. So I'm doing this for teachers. This is where I'm highlighting the various points that I'll be bringing out in the lesson. I'm also recommending a basic method of teaching, which is macro, micro, macro. Actually, we establish the main point from the lesson based on the micro points of each day, and then we bring those micro points out and discuss those in class, and then summarize them all back to the macro point and make a personal application. I'm also recommending a markup that I'm using is through my lesson. I'm using the particularly in use of the last one here, which is the hash symbol. But the first one, asterisk, is a new concept. The arrow is a personal need. The plus symbol is a personal help, and the hash symbol, you can see there, is something the class should understand. So that's I use that hash symbol quite often through the lesson, because that's something that helps me highlight those points in the lesson that I'm going to focus on when I'm teaching it to my class. So if you're not a teacher, that's fine. I hope you get something out of this, but for teachers, I hope you too can get something that will help you in teaching the Sabbath school this week. And if you get this video a bit late, please forgive me. I'm actually in Romania at the moment, and it's a bit difficult trying to get reliable internet access and time as well to do this video. So hopefully you'll get this in time for your Sabbath school. If not, maybe you'll get something to help you for the review for the following week. So thanks for watching, and let's have a look now through this lesson. Now, the macro point that I got, so let's have a look. Disasters in Israel is the lesson for this week. It's lesson number 10, lesson number 10, and we are looking at the children of Israel now on the borders of Canaan. They've conquered Jericho, and we now find that Balaam haven't conquered Jericho yet, I should say, but Balaam is they're about to plan for this conquest, and they are in danger. Well, the people around them are fearful now of Israel, what they've heard about, what they did to Egypt, what God did to Egypt through Israel, and now we see from last week that Balak, who was the king of the Moabites, was trying to get Balaam to curse Israel so that Balak could get a victory over them. Balaam, of course, failed because Israel were walking in obedience to God. They were blessed of God, and while they had God's blessing upon them, nothing could overcome them. Remember, God was going to take the land not by warfare, but by strict obedience to His commandments. That was His purpose. And so we have now children of Israel waiting here on the borders, and Balaam coming up with another plan to overcome them. And that plan is, as the note brings out here, is the more deadly evil. A more deadly evil. The key note there bringing out a more deadly evil than that presented by the mighty hosts of armed men, or the terrible beasts in the wilderness. So we'll see what this deadly evil is. Firstly, let's have a look for the macro point. Well, I got for me, I don't know what you got from the lesson, but for me, this is what I got, that standing on the borders of Canaan, one step from heaven, it's only the robe of Christ's righteousness that will protect us from unconscious deception, willful transgression, and the temptation to sinful indulgence. to sensual indulgence. So let me just repeat that. Standing on the borders of heavenly Canaan, one step from heaven, it's only the robe of Christ's righteousness that will protect us from unconscious deception and the willful transgression and temptation to sensual indulgence. So let's have a look here how this is brought out in the lesson. Firstly, the section number 1, an unexpected defeat. Okay, so they've just gained a wonderful blessing from the week before. We covered the wonderful blessing that Balaam was forced to give. As he opened his mouth, the Holy Spirit just gave that wonderful blessing upon Israel. But now they have an unexpected defeat. What happens? Balaam still desiring earnestly that reward of Balak, the reward of unrighteousness, to accomplish the task Balak had given him, which was to curse Israel. He comes up with a plan, and this plan was to somehow work out a way to remove God's blessing. And what he suggested here shows just how beguiling and how subtle the workers of iniquity really are. When it came to Israel, they unfortunately committed a terrible sin now on this borders. Balaam in Moab made a feast. Balaam encouraged the children of Israel to attend the feast. And of course, those who had not kept their eyes fixed on the goal before them were beguiled. They listened to the suggestions of the enemy. They were beguiled and enticed to attend this feast, attend this party, and it left them open to engaging in the music, the dancing, and unfortunately the terrible immorality they committed there, the sensual indulgence. So they finally transgressed the seventh commandment. Thousands of them did, and they reaped the consequences. So we know the mastermind behind this really was the devil, who it was Balaam really, but behind him was the devil. But the verse brings out Balaam, and he suggested to Israel to do this. So I just thought that was interesting. Now I would just be highlighting the key point here that I've got. It was when they ventured on the forbidden ground and were entangled in the snare of Satan. Okay, that was the problem. By venturing on forbidden ground, God puts hedges around us, or boundaries around us that are there for our own protection, for our own benefit. And sometimes we like to push those boundaries, and when we do, we're opening the door to the enemy. We're stepping on his ground by pushing the boundaries that God has placed there, and that leaves us open to deception without us even realizing it. We need to keep our eyes fixed on the goal set before us. We need to realize God's placed certain boundaries, certain limitations in our conduct, behavior, places we can go, things that we can do for our own protection. And unfortunately, with the children of Israel, they were beguiled. They pressed that boundary. They stepped over it onto forbidden ground. Were beguiled with dancing, music, and allured by the beauty of heathen vestals. They cast off their fealty to Jehovah. They united with in mirth and feasting, indulgence in wine, beclouded their senses, and they broke down the barriers of self-control. And that's when passion bore sway. It had full sway, and having defiled their consciences by lewdness, they were persuaded to bow down to idols. So here we have them now, just like their forefathers had done many, there's many years before. That's 40 years before, coming to that place where they bowed down to the golden calf. Now the same generation, their own children, now committing the same whoredom before the Lord. So this was a terrible event that took place. Sad point in their history. So how was the evil, the next section we're looking at now on Mondays, how was this evil suppressed? The point I got out of here is that, look, willful sin separates us from God. And I think that's what, that's what Moses understood. There were some who remained faithful understood that as well. That Moses and the judges of Israel were committed to punish those who had committed this whoredom, and to stay the men that were joined to Baal, and they did that. It says here, the Moabites and Midianites, iniquitous practice, did that for Israel, which all the enchantments of Balaam could not do. Okay, they separated them from God, and by swift coming judgments, the people were awakened to enormity of their sin. So that's why the judgments were swift. The Lord told them to slay all those who were joined unto Baal Peor, and they were slain immediately. And that awakened the people to the enormity of their sin. Now, at that time, that very time of killing all these ones who had been joined to Baal Peor, someone came into the camp, and this was brought out here in the lesson. That Zimri, one of the nobles of Israel, came boldly into the camp, accompanied by a Midianitish harlot. She was a princess of a chief house in Midian, and he took her into his tent. So this is right in the face of this terrible judgment that just had come upon the children of Israel. Zimri now brings this Midianite harlot into his tent, and in the face of terrible judgments. And what happened to him? Well, Phinehas, one of the priests, took his javelin and went into the tent and put the javelin through them both. Now, pretty harsh, you might think, but the lesson we learn from that is Phinehas' actions. Notice what happens here with his actions. God blesses him. This is just the abhorrence God has for willful. See, why that happened was this was willful, obstinate, rebellious transgression in the sight of judgments of God there. And Phinehas acted. He knew sin separated. He knew God was God was displeased with a whole lot of them. So he acted immediately. Did not even parley with the idea of trying to reason with Zimri. He just took the javelin and put it straight through him in obedience to the Lord. And the Lord had told him to slay all those that were joined, and Phinehas did just that. And the Lord blessed him. And you notice what it says there, that when he did that, let me just see here, I just want to bring out the note, or the verse. Because of doing that, it says here, the plague was stayed. I'm reading from Numbers 25 and verse 8. And he went after the men of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the men of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel. And therefore the Lord said to tell Phinehas, behold, I give unto Phinehas, unto him my covenant of peace, and he shall have it, and his seed after him, even the covenant of an everlasting priesthood. So for that action of resolute firmness in dealing with open transgression, open sin, God blessed Phinehas, blessed him with an assurance of the everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made an atonement or reconciliation for the children of Israel. And you know, when you look at that language there, I'd be highlighting that as a wonderful type of Jesus Christ. Jesus has made an atonement for the children of Israel, and more than that, he's been blessed with the everlasting priesthood. So he has made reconciliation for our iniquities, and now as our everlasting priest, he is there in the heaven ministering for us, for our needs. And Phinehas, who I believe was a type of Christ in this regard. And that tells me too that, you know, Jesus Christ will judge open sin, open transgression. He's a friend of sinners, and he sympathizes with those who have weighed down with the burden of sin, and he's there to forgive and to cleanse. But for those who, in the light of his word, in the light of in the knowledge of his will, knowledge of his commandments, they persist in open transgression, he will judge. He will judge, but he will also forgive, as a high priest, our everlasting priest, those who turn to him in repentance. Unfortunately, the children of Israel, at this point in time, they knew fully well what God required of them, but by indulging in the alcohol, in the festivities, they'd cut themselves off from God entirely, and many lost their lives. Inflamed with let me just see here. Those judgment then came through the land. 24,000 was destroyed in a plague, and I think the note brings out, well, it's not in the note, but you'll get it in the extra reading, that that the survivors of the 40 years of wandering, that first generation that had committed the that had heard the word, that had mourned at the judgment, you'll perish in the wilderness, they perished there. The remainder. That's what the note brings out. Well, if you look at the extra reading, it brings that out. So then, when they numbered them, the only ones left of the previous generation were Caleb and Joshua. So that terrible sin and the judgment that followed finished off the rest. So making some applications now of this lesson to our own experience. Really, additional protecting measures. If we look here now under Tuesday's lesson, we see here that God requires obedience. It was obedience to His law that was protecting the children of Israel. As the Midianites were among the most degraded enemies of God and among the most dangerous neighbours of Israel, what was Moses instructed to do? And you know what? It says there that the verse brings out that they went and made war immediately. And they slew the kings of Midian, and they avenged the lord of Midian, and they slew them, and Balaam also, the son of Beor, they slew with the sword. So immediately judgment followed on the Moabites, or rather the Midianites. And the reason was that they had that being such how would you say, they were slain immediately, I believe, because they were a dangerous neighbour to Israel, one who is set upon or bent upon their destruction. The Amalekites were not so bold. They were. It was many years later before the Amalekites were destroyed, but just showing that God makes a difference between some nations. So. But the note what I get from this day's lesson for me was regarding Christ's righteousness. I like the last section of this day here, that on what condition has God promised to protect His people? We know it's the condition of obedience. And if we read there, God says, "Hearken diligently to the voice of the Lord, and to observe to do all His commandments, and He will set thee on high above all nations of the earth." So if we are obedient to God, the only way we can be obedient to God is by having that law of God in our hearts. I delight to do thy will, O my God, thy law is within my heart. How do we get God's law in our hearts? By having Christ's righteousness within our hearts. And how do we get Christ's righteousness? By surrendering our life to Him, and repenting of our sin, and accepting His forgiveness, and being clothed with His righteousness. And that's why it says, the note brings out here, that the church is God's agency for the proclamation of the truth, empowered by Him to do a special work. And if she is loyal to Him, obedient to all His commandments, there will dwell within her the excellency of divine grace. If she will be true to her allegiance, if she will honour the Lord God of Israel, there is no power that can stand against her. If the church will put on the robe of Christ's righteousness, withdrawing from all allegiance with the world, there is before her the dawn of a bright and glorious day. I want to emphasize that, withdrawing from all allegiance with the world. This is how we put on Christ's righteousness, to separate from the world, to unite with Christ. He covers us, and that covering is our protection from sin, from temptation, from the terrible consequences of sensual indulgence and beguilement that the enemy has out there for us. So we need to have that experience of being clothed with His righteousness, and maintaining that experience, to be secure from the enemy. And that the heart of it is separating. Well, the heart of it is realizing that we are sinners, but to realize too that sin separates, and we have to separate from sin. We have to separate ourselves from the world, from the spirit of the world, its customs, habits, and practices, in order that we might maintain that covering of Christ's righteousness, that He might clothe us, and we might maintain that covering upon us. And that's our protection. That's our protection. Another lesson that we can learn comes out under Wednesday's lesson, which is a lesson regarding a couple of points I got here. Two main ideas that come through for me. One was the power of a woman upon a man, and the other was the friendship with the world. And we know that why should, well, the verse is asking, or the question's asking here, why should we, and especially those who have been called to take part in the work of God, study the ups and downs of the children of Israel? Because they're written for our example, that we should not lust after evil things and make the same mistakes that they lusted after. We're standing right now on the borders of Canaan, just as they were, and we have many temptations, many dangers before us, and one of those is the temptation to sensuality, the temptation to immorality, the temptation to transgression of the seventh commandment. This whole world, it seems, particularly in the Western world, is given themselves, is given up to sensuality. We see it in the advertising. We see it in media, all forms of media. We see it all through the internet, and we need to be aware through the devices that we're using, our electronic devices, accessing the internet. It's so accessible, all this stuff, and we just need to be aware that the power that the enemy is using, he's appealing to a fallen human nature to beguile us into sin, and thus cut us off from salvation, from heaven. So we need to be aware of those enchantments that he has prepared for us, and not give ourselves over to them. So both brothers and sisters, we can both help each other. Sisters in the way they conduct their lives, in terms of their dress, in terms of their behaviour, their modesty, and brethren in the way that we conduct our lives, in also showing, in treating a woman with modesty and respect, and shutting the avenues of temptation, closing off or guarding well the avenues of the soul, and not stepping on forbidden, or venturing on forbidden ground in our own life, in our own experience of every day. So we need to be careful ourselves. So we see, let me think, under here, also under B, well, the counsel is given there, 1 Corinthians 10, let us not commit fornication as some of them committed. So there's an appeal, direct appeal to us based on the children of Israel's experience, not to commit fornication as they committed. Alright, and so as we approach the time, I'd be just highlighting this on my lesson, this note, as we approach the close of time, as the people of God stand upon the borders of the heavenly Canaan, Satan will, as of old, redouble his efforts to prevent them from entering the goodly land. So that's what he's trying to do to us, prevent us from entering the goodly land. He's doubling his efforts to do that. And how does he do that for us today? Just the section of the lesson here, by worldly friendships, by the charms of beauty, by pleasure seeking, mirth, feasting, or the wine cup. He tempts to the violation of the seventh commandment. He seduced Israel into licentiousness before leading them to idolatry. So just highlighting to me that the friendship with the world is enmity with God, and all these things are just the spirit of the world, and we need to be aware that we do not become friends of the world. We're in the world, but not to be of the world. We're here to witness to the world, to be a light to the nations around us, and the moment we venture on forbidden ground, we're opening the door to the enemy. We are opening the door to the beguilement or the allurements of the enemy, tempted to music, attracted by the music of the world, the festivities of the world, the customs and habits and practices of the world, we will leave ourselves open to sensuality, spiritual idolatry, and everything else that follows with that. So let's learn the lessons from Israel and keep our eyes fixed on Jesus Christ and Him crucified, that we might ensure we have that covering constantly to protect us, to keep us from these things and respect the boundaries God's put there for us. Looking at the last section of the lesson, on the Thursday, how the way was prepared for sinning. Example was given under this lesson of Sodom, what its problem was when God brought the judgments down upon them. Why did they eventually get into so much trouble, why were they led away into the terrible iniquity and practices that they committed? It says there in the note that the verse says that it was through pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness. And so for me, to avoid that kind of thing, we know in the Bible, in Romans, it tells us to overcome evil with good. So how can we avoid all these things around us, all these attractions and allurements around us? It's by shunning idleness, number one. Number two, it's fullness of bread, being prepared to deny ourselves for the blessing of others around us. And number three is our humility. That is humbling ourselves before the Lord and the promises He will lift us up. It's only as we behold Christ and Him crucified, and we look to Jesus, we see His experience, His example, where as one equal with God, He came, found Himself in fashion as a man. He humbled Himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. And that was a wonderful humility He practiced for us. And so we should, and it will lead us to humble ourselves, to not live to ourselves, but to Him that died for us. So how do we overcome evil? We overcome evil with good, by humility, self-denial, and useful activity in blessing others. That's what I got out of this lesson. And wherefore, let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And so to overcome that temptation, the temptations around us, let us keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, ensuring that we are clothed with His righteousness. Let us seek to do good. Let us deny ourselves, and focus on being the positive in our experience. Focus on helping others, walking in the footsteps of Jesus, and obeying His will at all times. And thus we will preserve ourselves from the subtle temptations of the enemy. We won't be leaving ourselves open to unconscious deception, and thus venturing on forbidden ground. So may God help us in the lesson for this week, and I pray that you'll get a blessing as you go through the class and go through the lessons, or presenting these lessons. And if you've enjoyed the video, please pass it on if you think it would be a help for someone else. Until next time, take care, God bless, and enjoy your study of the Sabbath Bible lessons in our Sabbath schools for this week. Take care. Bye for now.